Oh man, I'm so excited for this. I love this movie. This is the kind of movie that reminds me why I love movies. It's smart, it's well written, it's touching, the characters are engaging, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's do this! Ladies and gentlemen, Source Code. So, there's been no small bit of confusion over the decision to include this in Video Game Movie Theme Month, since it, isn't an adaptation of a video game, and video games don't feature prominently in the plot. So I think I should explain why we picked it. This actually goes back to Crank 2. In that review, we talked about how the film's narrative arc mirrors that of most video games. The important point was that games tend to create dramatic tension through gameplay failure, where the player outside the story fails to accomplish the goals set before them and must retry the scenario until they execute it successfully. Crank 2 represented that narrative arc stripped of the external failure, and this is where Source Code comes into the discussion. Source Code's narrative conceit borrows the mechanics of video games in order to deliver a legitimately unique story that's equal parts mystery and puzzle game. While not explicitly called such, Captain Colter Stevens is thrust into a game every time he's sent into the source code. So before we can get any further, we need to get on the same page with all that techno-babble and stuff. Because this is a film with a mystery and plot twists and all that jazz, if you don't want to be spoiled, well, I'm sorry. Captain Colter Stevens is an Army helicopter pilot who gets blown up while on a mission in Afghanistan. The Army reports him as dead, and the Air Force hooks him up to an experimental system called Source Code in a project named Beleaguered Castle. Source Code the Machine was invented by Dr. Rutledge and is helmed by Captain Goodwin. It allows them to send a person's consciousness into the last 8 minutes of someone's life. How they do this isn't explained in detail, and the details are, frankly, unimportant.
What is the source code?
Quantum mechanics, parabolic calculus, it's very complicated.
That's not to say that everything about source code is unimportant, since there's some very important game mechanics involved. It's just that the science of how source code works doesn't matter. In this case, which is the first outing of the source code project, Captain Stevens is sent into the life of Sean Fentress, a professor of history who was riding a commuter train into Chicago when it exploded, killing all on board. His goal is to discover the identity of the bomber in order to prevent a nuclear bomb from being set off in Chicago. The bulk of the movie is spent alternating between the real world and the source code as Stevens pieces together the puzzle of the train and the reality of his condition. At the start of the film, he thinks he's in the cockpit of some kind, but slowly learns that he's technically dead as far as the world is concerned. In the source code, he develops a relationship with Christina, the film's love interest, and in the real world he argues with Goodwin and Rutledge about the morality of his situation. In short, he gets to know Christina, then gets blown up. He finds the bomb, then gets blown up. He tries to get his hands on a gun, then gets blown up. He assaults some people, then gets blown up. He chases a man into the station, then gets hit by a train. He gets blown up, then gets blown up again, then gets blown up a few more times after that just for good measure. Before he goes in again, he cuts a deal with Rutledge that they'll pull the plug on him and let him die once the mission is over. They agree, he goes in, figures out that Derek Frost is the bomber, confronts him, and gets himself and Christina shot in a parking lot. Back in the real world, he tells Goodwin and Rutledge about Frost. They call it into the authorities. Frost is arrested. Rutledge reneges on the deal. Goodwin betrays Rutledge and sends Stevens in one last time so he can try and save everyone on the train. He pulls it off flawlessly, mocks the bomber, calls his dad, pays Russell Peters to do a stand-up routine, kisses Christina, Goodwin pulls the plug, and Stevens lives on in Sean Fentress's body. Happy endings for everyone. There's a little bit more after that, but we'll come back to it. First off, why throw this into a series about video game movies? Simply put, source code is a game. How do I get off saying that he's playing a game? Well, for that we have to look at what makes something a game. So strap in, because we're about to get good and crunchy with our definitions here. Games are sets of rules. These rules can be generally divided into 3 kinds: the board, the procedures, and the goals. Goals are self-explanatory. They're the things that the player wants to accomplish in order to bring the game to a close, ideally winning. Procedures are all the things that you normally think of when you hear about rules. What counts as a valid move, what are the penalties for a violation, scoring systems, and so forth all fall into this category. The board is the defined limitations of the game system and can actually be a lot of different things. Board games have a literal board, sports have a field, video games have the game world, card games have a starting layout, and role-playing games have a communal agreement of assumptions and the foundational structure of character generation. There's one more important characteristic, and that's metaphor. The actions taken in the game are arbitrary and symbolic. They do not have intrinsic external consequences. That's important because the entire point of a game is to present the challenge of conflict resolution without the actual risk. In fact, most competitive games, from chess to football to StarCraft, are really simulations of war without the actual killing of other people. This all carries over to source code. The goal of the game is to discover the bomber, the board is the train, the passengers, the starting position, and the 8-minute time limit. The procedures, well, he's not actually given many restrictions, and this is where the video game part of things come in. Because the rules in a video game are all handled by a computer, many of the overt procedures become invisible. There's no need for a list of illegal moves or fouls when the programmers can make it functionally impossible to cheat. You just can't drop an extra handful of Marines into StarCraft while your opponent is grabbing a sandwich. In this case, Captain Stevens is given free rein to use whatever means he wants, and the only scoring is a binary pass-fail. One last point, the intrinsic consequences. He's told repeatedly that his actions in the source code have no impact on the real world. Saving or killing someone in the game doesn't save or kill them in reality.
Well, but she survived. And maybe the rest could too.
She survived, but only inside the source code. None of them can be saved.
Something I find really neat is that this game metaphor isn't even something that I'm overtly reading into all of this. Remember what the name of the program was?
What unit is this?
You're with Beleaguered Castle.
Well, the project name, Beleaguered Castle, comes from an obscure version of Solitaire. This is awesome script writing, by the way. The whole reference is actually a multi-layered metaphor. First, Beleaguered Castle is a game. Second, it refers to a castle that's under attack. In this case, Chicago is the castle, and the attacks are, well, yeah, that blowing up thing. Third is the nature of the card game itself. In Beleaguered Castle, the player lays out the cards as such and then moves them around in an attempt at getting everything to stack properly in the center. It's not so much a game of skill as it is a process of unraveling a puzzle. The trick is that the game is incredibly difficult, and most hands are doomed to fail after only a few moves. The only way to actually win is to keep playing hands until things work out. See the connection yet? Captain Stevens is presented with a puzzle that's doomed to end with an explosion, and the only way for him to win is to keep trying. Every time he starts over, the layout is the same, the players are the same, the setting is the same, and the goal is the same, but changing variables change the outcome of the game. In the cards, the variable is the random dealing of the deck. In the film, it's his changing knowledge of the situation. See, now all of this is good script writing. I love it. And I'm actually going to cut this episode off here. Next week we're going to talk about source code again, but we're going to have a bit of fun with it. So next week, the dark side of source code.
On a mission. Promise me you'll help him. And when you do me a favor. Tell him everything is going to be okay.